I'm about to talk about is not a conspiracy theory. It's not speculation. It's not rumor. It's documented, declassified, and it happened to real people. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA launched a secret program called MKUltra, a Cold War-era experiment in mind control where government-funded doctors drugged, shocked, and psychologically shattered human beings without their consent. Now, most of the records were burned in 1973 by the CIA director at the time to hide the truth. But what survived is horrifying. Patients put into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, massive doses of LSD, electroshock at 40 times the normal strength, taped messages played on repeat for days, and the complete erasure of people's personalities, memories, and identities. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. Many of these victims weren't even mentally ill. They were ordinary people, mothers with postpartum depression, men dealing with anxiety, young adults going through stress. They checked into a hospital for help, and the government turned them into experiments. The CIA secretly funneled money through front organizations into a Montreal hospital using a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron to carry out some of the most brutal psychological experiments ever conducted on civilians. Families were destroyed. Lives were erased, and for decades, the U.S. government has refused to take responsibility. But today, things might be changing. A major lawsuit, one of the last remaining chances for truth and accountability, is finally forcing the U.S. government to confront its role in MKUltra, and the attorney leading the fight is here with us. He's representing the survivors and the families who are still living with the consequences of what the CIA tried to bury. This is about whether the government can commit human rights abuses, destroy the evidence, and walk away without ever answering for it. Joining me now is Jeff Orenstein, the attorney taking on the United States government in the MKUltra lawsuit and trying to bring justice to the people whose minds, memories, and lives were stolen. Jeff, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Explain to us MKUltra. When did it happen? What was the point? Who did it? Give us the breakdown.
Sure. So MKUltra was one of the projects of the CIA. We're talking about the years approximately April 1953, and it supposedly terminated in 1973. There's some allegations it continued further, but as far as the records we can see, it was 1953 to 1973. But you had other projects as well that were Project Bluebird, Artichoke. I mean, there were other projects by the CIA that were similar, but not necessarily the same. So with regard to MKUltra, this was all started because after the Korean War, a lot of the American POWs came back, and they were very sensitive to the communist cause. And so what the American government thought was that it must be that the Soviets, the communists, they must have come up with brainwashing techniques, and they were very ahead in this field. It turns out this is not actually true, and in fact, a lot of it can be explained by Stockholm syndrome, where you become sympathetic to your captors. But at the time, they said, well, it must be that the Soviets have brainwashing techniques, and we need to develop our own because, you know, you've got the Cold War here, and we can't be behind Russia. And so they instituted this program by the CIA, and they were going to study different forms of brainwashing techniques. They did a lot of experimentation with drugs, including LSD is obviously the most famous of it, and it led to, there was a suicide that took place within the CIA. So there was a lot of experimentation, and they funded, in addition to doing some studies themselves experiments themselves with LSD and other drugs, they funded a lot of universities. And I think by the time they were done, when this was all discovered in around 1977, and I'll get to how they discovered it, because all the documents were actually destroyed after 1973. They tried to erase, any record of this, although they didn't destroy the financial documents. So that was uncovered. But at the end of it, they were about 149 universities or hospitals that were involved in the funding of these experiments. And one thing that is interesting is that some of these doctors and hospitals and universities may or may not have even known that they were being funded by the CIA. I say that because they use front organizations. In the case of this project that we're going to be talking about, which was Sub-Project 68. It was through Cornell University, there was something created called the Human Ecology Fund. And it's that organization that was funding Dr. Cameron and McGill University and the Royal Victoria Hospital here in Montreal, Canada. And there's some debate whether Dr. Cameron even knew he was being funded by the CIA. I mean, there's people believe he did know because he knew he had some connections to the CIA. But this is basically the general explanation. It was brainwashing experiments being tested and funded by the CIA. That is what MKUltra was.
Okay, well, it makes sense, the beginning stages of it, of why they decided to start doing this. They think, well, they must be brainwashing, so we've got to start brainwashing. I mean, that's usually how it starts, right? They've got weapons, we've got to have those same weapons, so we need to develop this. So they started this, but who did they experiment on? My understanding is that a lot of these people didn't know that they were even victims. They didn't, like they were essentially, I mean, in my mind, when I hear that somebody was experimented on without them knowing, I think they were kidnapped. Maybe these are the people that think they were kidnapped by aliens. You know, there's people that say, I was abducted by aliens last night. They did experiments on me and then they brought me back. Like maybe it was the CIA doing that to them. Maybe it was MKUltra. Were there people that volunteered and they knew that they were being experimented on, or was everybody experimented on without them realizing it?
So I'm not sure about everybody because I haven't studied all 149 projects. My main focus was Sub-Project 68. That's the one that we filed the class action about. But when I say that they didn't know, I was talking about even the people performing the experiments. Listen, they knew they were experimenting. Okay, that's clear. What they didn't necessarily know is that they were actually working for the CIA as part of the MKUltra project. There's some debate whether all of these doctors and universities knew that, but they certainly knew they were experimenting. Now we go to the patients. Many times, listen, in the case of Sub-Project 68, what we called the Montreal experiments with Dr. Cameron and the brainwashing, which we'll get into his particular technique, I can tell you they did not know. The patients had no idea. What happened was you had patients that were coming in from all over Canada. They were going to this hospital at the Allen Memorial because Dr. Cameron, who was in charge of this, who was the head of the department at McGill, who was the chair of the university of the department, who was the head of the psychiatric department of the hospital, he was very well known and very well respected. So people were coming from all over, and they had lots of different types of psychiatric illnesses. But I will mention this. So you did have, people with schizophrenia, but you also had, at the time, you had women with postpartum. I mean, this is not today, this would not be something you admit somebody, you institutionalize somebody. Our client, Miss Tanny, so her father, he had some dental surgery, and after that he was having pain, and it was a pain in his jaw. And today, we would know that that's just nerve damage, and they have a pill for that, But back then, what would happen, and by the way, this is similar even to doctors today, but if they look at, they use their testing, and if they can't figure out what the problem is, well, it must be psychosomatic. It must be in your head. So, they convinced him that he was obviously crazy. So he went into the Allen Memorial to be treated for this pain in his jaw, which was just nerve damage, easily treatable. And instead, what happened to him is he ended up, being subjected to these experiments and this testing under the guise of treatment. But it was, of course, never treatment. But that's what he thought he was getting. And in the end, he ended up being nearly a vegetable and unable to function in the world. And I mentioned the same thing with women who were postpartum. I mean, today, this is obviously not a mental illness. This can be easily treated. You certainly don't get institutionalized for it. So what I should mention is that a lot of the patients that they were coming in expecting to be treated by a very well-respected psychiatrist, for the record, they were expecting to get, some of the greatest treatment in the world. And instead of treatment, they were being experimented on. They didn't know it. And these are not the most extreme cases. There could be, probably not today, but maybe at the time, according to the morals and standards of medicine at the time, if this was the last treatment, the last line of defense, for someone who's a patient that you've tried everything else on, and you say, listen, there's nothing I can do. This person is unfortunately is a lost cause, and let's try something experimental. Maybe today, by the way, you would need informed consent. Okay, even that's clear. But maybe that could be explained. But that is not the situation we're talking about. We're talking about people that came in with many different varieties of what may be mental illness or maybe not, and instead were given these massive electroshock therapy as well as sleep therapy, and we'll get into some of the techniques that were used.
Right. Okay. To kind of back up a little bit here, you said that there was the class action lawsuit that you're specifically working on is for sub project 68. Is that what you said?
That's correct. Yes.
And you say that with MKUltra there was 150 different programs under MKUltra.
That's what the documents support. There were 149 programs, yes, of the MKUltra program.
Programs. And so you only know about and have documented evidence of one of these programs out of 149.
I think there's documentation about a lot of them. My class action only really is related to one.
Okay.
Many of it took place some of it took place in the U.S., some of it took place overseas. I mean, mine is specifically because I'm a lawyer in Montreal, Canada. So this is a case, part of the project that did take place in Montreal, and that's what the class action's about. Yes.
Got it.
But just to mention how this was discovered, because I don't know how extensive the documentation will be, because in 1973, the director of the CIA ordered all the documents from the MKUltra project to be destroyed. And what happened was that in 1977, it was an author, Helms, who was writing In Search of the Manchurian Candidate, who did an access information request. And he got documents on financial records, accounting records, and things like that. And so they were able to sort of piece this together as to what happened through the financial records. So those I'm aware do exist. That's probably how they know about 148 projects, not because they have all the documents of exactly what happened in the projects, but it costs money to do these things, and they were financed by the CIA. And so those records they have, yes, which led to congressional hearings in the late 70s.
It's stunning that a CIA director can order the destruction of documents and not go to prison for that. Do you know if there were any consequences for that CIA director, or was he dead by the time they figured it out?
Right. I'm not sure that there were consequences. I mean, there were congressional hearings, so I know the U.S. government certainly looked into it. I don't know if he was still alive at the time. That was beyond the scope of my case.
It just goes to show. I mean, like we could search for documents, we could search for records. Right now, everybody wants the Epstein files, and it's like, it just goes to show they'll just destroy them. I mean, if there's something in it that they don't want people to know about, they'll just go and destroy it. Now we have evidence of the CIA doing just that for MKUltra. They'll just destroy things that they don't want people to know about. And that's not the first nor the last time that they did that. So about this sub project 68, and this is because it happened in Canada against Canadians. The U.S. government was funding this. The doctors that were doing these experiments, I mean, there's got to be some sort of, was there any record or have you been able to talk to any of these doctors or anybody on staff at the time that was doing these experiments where they questioned the ethics and the morality of doing this to people? You said that they didn't even really know that they knew they were experimenting, but they didn't know they were experimenting on behalf of the U.S. government, on behalf of the CIA. But they were still experimenting on these people. And they had these patients coming to them who were suffering from whatever it was. And these doctors, regardless of who was paying for it, still opted to experiment on these people. Did they ever question what they were doing? Or, I mean, is this just, we're more enlightened now, so now we, of course, think this is abhorrent and shocking. But is there any record of what they thought about what they were doing?
So there were other doctors that questioned it at the time. So just to be clear, the main doctor in charge, we're talking about Dr. Ewan Cameron. He was the doctor who was, as I mentioned, he was the head of the McGill Psychiatric Department, the head of the department at the Royal Victoria Hospital. He was the one in charge of the Allen Memorial. He was also president, he was at certain times president of the Psychiatric Association of Quebec, Psychiatric Association of Canada, and he was one of the co-founders of the Psychiatric Association's World Psychiatric Association. So we're talking about a guy who was very well known. He also, by the way, was brought in by the US government for the Nuremberg trials as well. So he was very well known. He was originally Scottish, but then he immigrated to the US. He became a US citizen, even though he spent most of his career in Montreal. And he died, I believe it was 1967. So we're talking about he died a long time ago. Just to be clear, the experiments we're talking about was, as far as our class action, that's our time period, was 1948 to 1964. So that's the time period we're discussing. He, of course, was started at McGill and the Royal Victoria in 1943, but he was then gone. He retired in 1965. Well, not retired, but he left and he went back to New York. In Albany, he worked there for a while, and he eventually was climbing a mountain and had a heart attack. So certainly we weren't going to ask him anything. He died a long time ago. But when you look at the literature, there were definitely other doctors, because to do this, we argued that you need a village. It can't be one person that did this. You had the orderlies, other doctors, nurses, staff, the universities, the hospitals. Everybody could have done something, in our opinion. That's what we allege, and instead didn't. But to answer your question, were there doctors that questioned what he was doing at the time? Absolutely. There were some. Immediately after he stepped down as director of the hospital, before they even looked at, they actually had a study done to see what the results were. Before they even waited for the answer, they immediately abandoned his program. Okay, so clearly the doctors, they couldn't stand up to him because he was a very powerful name in psychiatry. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, you didn't really stand up to Dr. Cameron. He was the main name, just not just in Canada, internationally. So I think a lot of people, they had their doubts, but they didn't want to act because, he was still the main man and very well respected. I mean, just keep in mind, I made this argument to the judge. This is a case of hiding in plain sight. I mean, this is not what Dr. Cameron was doing. Was not really hidden. I mean, he was publishing medical journal articles at the time. He was going off and giving conferences and telling everybody what he was doing. And if you actually read his journal articles or listen to his conferences and you see what he's doing, this is torture, plain and simple. I mean, if you read it and you look at it, you can't really draw a conclusion that there's any medical benefit to what he's doing. It's torture. But again, I mean, you put on a suit and you look all respectable and you go to conferences and, everybody thinks that it's fine. But of course, we know now that it wasn't. One other mention that I do want to say to you is that the CIA's involvement, the CIA didn't create Dr. Cameron and they didn't create his research. They came in, our class action goes back to 1948. But the CIA started funding in 1957. I mean, they came in and they asked him to apply for a grant in 1956, but they basically started financing in 1957. So he was already pretty well advanced. And what happened was, from what we've seen, is that the CIA became interested in his work. They saw that there was a relation to brainwashing because, and I'll explain to you what he was doing, but they saw this connection and they thought that this research could very well be useful for their MKUltra project. And they knew that because they had read one of his papers, they had seen his conferences, and they said, well, he's doing something that we think could help, expand our knowledge on brainwashing experiments. But of course, he had alleged that he was also being financed by the Canadian government. He was financed, there was also McGill's involvement, either by doing something or they could have stopped him, and as well the Royal Victoria Hospital. I just want to mention that the CIA didn't create Dr. Cameron, but they certainly helped him advance his cause.
That makes sense. I mean, it seems like the CIA would go around scouting and say, ooh, this guy's doing something kind of interesting. Maybe we can, get in on that and fund it more and help him do more, and it benefits us, rather than them having their own team of scientists or doctors. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's an important point because it shows that somebody could be working outside of the government, but still be working for the government, essentially. They're contracting with the government. They're taking funds from the government. The government's giving them directives, but they're not working for the government. So there could be a whole host of programs and different experiments that we don't really know about because the doctors aren't working directly underneath the U.S. government or any government for that matter, right? They're working on their own, seemingly.
Except that in this case, there's debate whether he even knew himself that he was working for the CIA.
Okay.
That Dr. Cameron even knew himself, because when you look at some of the paperwork, and there is some, we do have some documents of recovery from the project, Subproject 68, and it actually says in it that Dr. Cameron is unwitting, so that he's not even aware he's being financed by the CIA. And keep in mind, he wasn't actually directly financed by the CIA. He was financed by a organization, the Human Ecology Fund, which was just a name that they created to sort of hide the fact that the CIA was involved.
Right.
But I will mention that there's certainly documentation where people do at least hypothesize that he would have known that he was working for the CIA, because when he was brought into the Nuremberg trial, so I had mentioned that earlier, some of the people he knew who had brought him in ended up working for the CIA. And what he had done there, which is, quite relevant, because I just saw a couple of weekends ago, I saw the movie Nuremberg in theaters. And so in that case, they talk about Dr. Hess. They don't go into this whole MKUltra project in the movie, but Dr. Hess was one of the Nazi doctors, and he had flown over England, and his plane crashed, and he had claimed that he had amnesia. He couldn't remember anything, and so when they did put him on trial, Dr. Ness on trial, the U.S. government looked at, is his amnesia real? Is he crazy? We can't put a guy on trial who's clearly not fit to stand trial. And so one of the doctors that they brought in to evaluate Dr. Hess was Dr. Cameron. That's how his reputation, Dr. Cameron's reputation, was worldwide. They brought him in to evaluate whether Dr. Hess really was fit to stand trial, or was he insane. And Dr. Cameron said, he did not believe the amnesia, and he said he was sane and fit to stand trial. And the other important part about Nuremberg is that at the end of the Nuremberg trials, there was the Nuremberg Code, which was from 1947. And one of the criticisms, or not criticisms, but one of the defenses that have been put forward is that consent to care today is obviously a well-developed concept. Every legal system has it. We all know what it means. But one of the arguments being put forward, and I don't buy it, is that back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it was still being developed. The legal concept was being developed. But one of the things that came out of the Nuremberg trials was the Nuremberg Code, and one of the main rules is you must get informed consent from patients before you do experimentation on them. That's one of the things the Nazi doctors, of course, didn't do. And that was one of the rules that came out of it. So you could not say that Dr. Cameron, who testified, who was part of the Nuremberg trial, was brought in, didn't know about the rules from Nuremberg. And you also can't really say it wasn't, the informed consent was not a concept even in the 50s and 60s, because the Nuremberg Code is 1947.
Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can catch Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. It is free for you to watch. Again, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, KimIversonShow.com. See you there.